After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, take the pawn, knight takes back, and now bishop to c5. So the Scotch game is happening. And in this video we're going to go through things that we haven't seen yet. Let's start from this move, knight f5 immediately. Black goes on with d5. This is important. So in this position, let's see. Knight takes g7 with check. Let's start with this move. We're going to look at other moves as well. This is not good because the king moves to f8 and now there's an attack on the knight. This cannot be defended with the bishop simply because you can take with the knight. So this knight will have to move back. Two moves we're going to look at before we change variation. Knight f5 or knight h5. Knight f5 is a very simple variation now because you take the knight. And after the only move that makes sense, which is to take back, queen to h4 comes and there's this attack now on h4 threatening mate. And there's nothing good here now for white to be done. g3 cannot happen because queen e4 check and you are taking the rook. So instead of that, what about queen to d2 for instance? Where queen e2 is not possible because rook e8, you'll be pinning the queen. Now you can argue that after rook e8, the bishop can block, but then the bishop is pinned and you can play d4. But d4 are just an idea, but it's not really the most accurate move. The best move is rook takes e3. And now what? The queen can't take back because of the bishop and the pawn can't take back because it's pinned. So that is the most accurate way to play. So in this position, queen to d2. Seems like the only move. Okay, where rook e8 is coming with check. Do you see how much initiative the white player sacrificed by simply playing the knight f5 variation to win the pawn in g7 and misplace our king? Because our king is actually safe. But we have the initiative. Rook e8 check. What to do now? Okay, either we look at bishop e2 blocking or king to d1 moving away. None of them is going anywhere. Bishop to e2 blocking is met with queen check in f2. King has to move and now queen to g2 with an attack on the rook. The rook has to move, let's say rook to f1 for instance. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. Knight to d4 is coming anyway. There's like triple attack on this bishop. And after knight to c3, defending that bishop more, still we're going to take the bishop. Rook takes e2. And knight takes back allows us to simply take the bishop because we've removed the defender. Otherwise, queen takes back, but then we're winning so much material. So in this position, after the rook check, what happens if instead of bishop blocking, the king goes to d1? Okay, win the free pawn in f2 and also threaten rook to e1 check, forcing the white player to give us the queen for the rook. That is now not coming back. I mean, what do you think white's going to do? Okay, let's say, for example, something like bishop to d3 to allow the rook to defend this rank. This is met with queen to g4 check. And now the king can't move, so the only move will be bishop blocking. Queen cannot block because you're attacking with the rook. Bishop blocking, and now you're taking g2. And it's the same situation as before. The rook has to move, let's say to f1, because otherwise the bishop can take it, and knight to d4. It's exactly the same scenario as before, except the bishop now is in c7, except being in c5. But nothing changes. So in this position, if white plays bishop to b5, for instance, pinning our knight to the rook or something, same thing. Queen to g4 is the best move. The king can't move. White is forced to play bishop to e2, and then you carry on. Queen to g2. So let's look at the best move. What's the best move in this position? After the king has just gone to d1, after the rook's check, and the bishop takes the pawn in f2, the best move according to the engine is bishop to e2 already. This stops us from going queen g4 attacking this pawn. Okay, bishop to e3 comes now though. And the queen will have to move. Where? Okay, if the queen goes to d3, for example, whatever, the idea, okay, now you play knight b4. The queen will have to move. The queen moves, but either way, you're going to take this bishop and then remove the kings from defending the bishop in e2, then you can take a piece when the king takes you back. What about queen takes d5 instead? Well, this is the worst because rook d8 is a very effective pin. So in this position, what happens after queen to e1? Okay, give a check, queen d4 check. And now the white player will have to block. Well, not with the queen, of course, because of the attack with the bishop. Not with the bishop either, because you have an attack on b2, right? And bishop c3 cannot happen to attack your queen and defend the white's rook, because queen to c1 will be checkmate. So after knight blocks in d2, knight to f6, simply develop. And we're threatening to play knight e4, exploiting the pinned knight, and then knight f2, forcing the white player to give us the queen. So what happens after a counterattack? c3, okay, queen check. After b3, attacking the queen again, queen a5. Now there's an attack on c3. Okay, bishop b2, developing and defending that. Rook to g8, attacking this pawn and threatening to infiltrate. Pawn to g3 will penalize the freedom of the white queen. Besides, knight b5 can still happen, it's defended by the rook. There are no good moves here. If you think the white queen can just go to a5, getting some development, attacking the knight, doesn't matter, ignore it. Rook takes g2, and after the queen takes the knight, you can also take the bishop in e2, completely careless, because obviously if king takes you, then you have a discovered check, you move this bishop, it's check, and then you can, obviously this bishop is on the same color of this queen, so you can win the queen for free. And the queen's check in h8 doesn't do anything, you just move the king, there are no other checks now. I mean, there are checks, but they all do nothing. So in this position, after rook g8, what happens if simply bishop to f3? Allowing the queen to be stronger, and also defending this pawn, and placing the bishop in a better place. Okay, well, it doesn't matter, d4. And now we're going to take this pawn no matter what. Unless black wants to let us do the fork, pawn takes pawn. Or let's say if white plays knight to c4, attacking the queen looks like a good move, but still queen f5, you're completely winning this game. This king will never be safe. Our king actually is. So let's go from the start. Let's explore the other variation, the one with knight h5. So d4, take, bishop c5, and now the early knight f5. Okay, d5 comes, and after knight check, king moves. Instead of knight back to f5, what happens after knight to h5? Okay, queen h4 happens anyway, and there's double attack here. There's an attack on the knight and an attack on the pawn in f2, the checkmate square. So the knight will be forced to play knight to g3, and it looks like white is defending everything. Okay, knight f6, developing and putting more attack over the center. Pawn takes pawn. This wins the pawn, also you can't take back because of the queen. Now it doesn't matter, knight to g4, and now we are piling up the attack. You see how much attack goes on f2, and there's no way for the opponent to stop us, because bishop e3 looks like it kind of stops everything, but in reality you got these two attackers, and when you swap everything, this bishop and this rook will come quickly into the attack of the king. Okay, let's make an example. Let's say bishop e3, okay, take it, pawn takes. And now knight to h2 is the best move. This allows us to keep the knight pinned. And we're winning material. There is no coming back here. You can't really go and defend the knight, for instance. Knight g4 comes, you are going to be capturing that knight. If the king sticks around to f3, this is just an example in case you think that the white player has a chance of keeping his material advantage. This actually gives you mate in 8, starting from queen f6. King moves. You got knight f2, mate in 1. If the king had gone up, check, king moves, check, king moves, check, king takes, check, and then mate next move. And in this position, we've been talking about how the game is compromised. You might argue, what happens if white just takes the knight and ignores what's happening here, doesn't get checkmated, and then goes on to win for material advantage? Okay, so the most accurate way to play is bishop takes f2 check, king moves, queen e7 check, king d2 will lead to checkmate straight away. So after king d3, bishop takes knight is the most accurate move. This is threatening knight to f2 check, winning the queen. So the pawn can't take back. So queen e2 now, developing, because it's the best move, but it's still pointless. Queen to c5 comes now. Still keeping an eye on the important f2 square. And black is completely winning, as you can tell. Pawn takes bishop. Can the white player try to continue this game? No, because of bishop f5 check, king to d2, queen c2 check, king to e1. Queen wins the bishop. Queen has to block, rook check. Bishop blocks, and now rook check again. King takes, then you got check and then checkmate in f2. If instead at this point the king moves, well, it doesn't matter, doesn't change anything. So let's take it from the start now and let's look at something different. d4 take, bishop c5, knight f5. Okay, d5 comes now. Let's see something we haven't seen. Let's say queen takes pawn in d5 straight away. Okay, here you take. So this is bad for white, obviously, because when white takes back, you have an attack on the knight. Now you may argue that white also has an attack on your knight. That's why we play knight b4 now, and there's two threats going on. One of them being bishop takes free piece. The other one, knight takes c2 with an attack on the rook. On a fork, basically. Here, according to the engine, the best move is bishop b5 check, and obviously you don't want to play c6 because after a bunch of swaps, it's actually really dangerous. So you gotta play king to d8 in order to keep the threat going on c2. Okay, knight to e3 is the engine move now. The knight is defending this, so you have to take it. And when the bishop takes back, you taking c2, king d2, attacking the knight, and also stop and allowing the rook to defend the other rook. So knight takes a1, best move, knight c3. This knight is now trapped, and we are up the exchange, and this is white playing the top engine moves in a faulty variation, where basically the advantage is not too much. White has the bishop pair, but we are up the exchange, so we're gonna play the game like that. Black's first move is knight e7 developing, rook takes knight f6, the best move. Black has an idea of playing a6, knight f5, and it shouldn't take long before the opponent bishop pair is taken. So you're supposed to be winning this endgame. You got a comfortable endgame because you're up the exchange. So let's move on to the other line. So from taking it from the start, what happens if the opponent takes us with the pawn? So after this and this, d5, white takes with the pawn. Bishop to f5, bishop takes knight, so we're up a piece. And now taking the knight is not possible, because you will simply play bishop takes f2 check. You got an attack on the queen. When the king takes your bishop, you're winning the opponent free queen, and there is no counter play here. So king takes, queen takes. Now you might argue that our opponent can play something like pawn takes with an attack on the rook and threatening bishop b5 check, allowing our opponent to take our queen back. So it's a bit dangerous, but you got nothing to worry, because first of all, you're gonna take this pawn with check. Our opponent will have to respond to the check whatever way he will choose to use to respond to the check. You will be able to play rook to b8 next, or even rook to d8 if you're in the mood. So in this position, we mentioned how the pawn cannot take the knight. So what happens after the best move, which is queen to e2 check? Okay, here you might argue, okay, knight c to e7, and we are up a piece, right? The knight that we took in f5. However, this is a computer line, so this is white playing the best moves, top engine moves to save himself. So white has done a piece, and this is a simple fork. Here the best move is c6, and now the queen can recapture the bishop. Okay, now here we take the d5 pawn, and we're equal, except our opponent has the bishop pair. So you're wondering what's going on here. Well, this is the absolute best variation for white, and I've kept it for the end of the video for this reason. But actually, it is better for black. You might wonder, okay, the opponent has the bishop pair. Yeah, but we have better development, and we've got a few weaknesses to mention. First of all, queen takes, knight takes, best moves. And now here, let's say white develops, does anything, you're going to take this pawn. This is a free pawn, there's no compensation. So let's look at bishop d3 allows us to take the bishop pair from our opponent, isolate his pawn, and then in that case we are definitely going to go to a better endgame. Knight to a3 instead to protect the pawn in c2. Okay, long castle. And after bishop develops, because you see e3 is no good, f4 is no good, you always get taken g5, you can attack it again, so there's no point. Okay, rook e8 check. And now we've just taken the opponent's right to castle away. Unless white plays bishop to e2. But now black goes on with development, knight g to f6. And now remember, a move like c4 cannot be played because bishop to d3 wins the game. They can take our piece, but then rook takes with check. Then the other rook is coming here, position evaluated -4 or something like that. So that move can't happen. f3 to stop our knight from infiltrating or our pieces from moving really, and also allowing some artificial castle like king f2 or something. It doesn't matter. You play knight e3 is the best move. Now you're threatening to win a pawn here. You're also threatening to win this pawn. Then you have a shelter in h4. So after take, you are inevitably going to win the bishop pair from our opponent. King to f2, now you go back to e7. Rook h to e1, these are all best moves. Rook h to e8. c3 to stop our idea of winning that pawn. So white doesn't have to worry anymore. b5. Stopping knight c4. So let's look at knight b1. Now the idea of playing knight to d2, and then maybe e4 later on, or maybe b3, idea of c5. This is obviously a massive mistake because bishop to d3, we got 3 attackers over e2, and if bishop takes, then we are winning the exchange. If instead white plays, let's say, I don't know, rook to d1, king to c7, and now rook to d2, the idea of actually being able to play knight b1, but then it's not that there's much to do, but maybe transfer the rook on this side, or maybe playing bishop to d3 afterwards. Black plays rook to d7, and after rook e to d1, and rook takes. This is a sample, this has been a sample of how to go about in a game that is played entirely by the engine. You're not going to get to this point, you're not going to be able to play this game against anyone because you should have won way before that. So if white plays the only best moves for around 25 moves in a row, which is never going to happen, then you will be in this situation, which is slightly better for black, but it's still quite an equal game. Obviously it is an equal game. So let's look at one more thing I forgot to mention so far. d4, take, and now bishop c5. This is from one of the previous videos when they play bishop e3. Now, as you know, you've been watching this how to beat the Scotch saga, so you should have watched the previous videos. If you haven't, check them out in my channel. Okay, queen f6 now, as you know, is the move. Let's look at knight to f5 now. This is a move I've encountered already, and I was wondering what to do because it actually kind of put me off. Because you see here, the usual idea, the thematic idea is to take the bishop in e3, break the pawn structure, isolate and double up these 2 central pawns, and go for a better endgame. In this case though, the knight is protected by the pawn and it's also defending the bishop, so what to do now? Here you ignore everything and you just go for the pawn in b2. Ignore the bishop here, because you're going for the rook. So you literally don't have to worry about the bishop, even though it looks a bit dangerous, because after bishop takes e5, you take the rook. It looks like bishop to d4 might attack the queen and the pawn in g7, trapping the rook. Obviously we're going to have to give up the knight for that very powerful bishop. A move like c3, cutting off our queen from this defense, also allowing ideas like knight g7, looks like really complicated. But now you just play d6, crucial move. Knight g7 is not a problem because you have an attack on this bishop. After king f8 you're going to have an attack on the knight. So after, let's say, bishop to d4 for instance, just swap everything. Knight takes, pawn takes. Obviously the queen can't take because there's an attack on the knight. and then bishop takes, pawn takes. You're up the exchange, and now also up a few pawns. Well, a couple of pawns. Position evaluated -4 or something. So let's take this one now for the last time from the start. The idea is to look at another line. Bishop c5, bishop e3. So we're going to play queen f6, and we're looking at the knight f5 type of idea in this position. We said you go for the pawn. What happens after knight to d2? Obviously we can't take the rook now, so d6 comes. It's a bit surprising. Well, think about it. If bishop takes and then you take back, you're going to have 4 pawns here against these two. It's a majority that already gives you the perspective of a completely winning endgame. So if bishop takes, pawn takes back. If rook attacks you, or maybe bishop takes, pawn takes back, and then rook b1, but rook b1 comes anyway, attacking our queen, kicking her away, the queen's going to go to f6. It's the best square, and also you got to keep defending the pawn in g7 from the attack of that knight. Let's see now, bishop to b5, for instance, pinning our knight and developing. The white player is dreaming to castle. Bishop to b6 comes now. This is the best move. If bishop takes, you can take with the pawn, a pawn, and then the rook is on an open file. Castle. Okay, now you take this knight. Pawn takes back. And now knight to e7. Putting more pressure over f5. Rook to e1 comes now. Long castle. Bishop now takes, you still take with the a pawn. You don't have to worry about this open file on your king side because the king is safe. Knight to e4 with an attack on the queen. Queen to f5 is the best move. No panic. Bishop to d3. King to b8 now comes because, you know, obviously the knight was threatening a check, winning the game. King to b8. And now knight to d6 actually doesn't do anything because the best move is rook takes d6. And when the bishop takes the queen, rook takes back, knight takes back, knight takes back. This is white having played the best moves in a faulty variation with up a pawn, and we have 2 knights for the rook, so it's a better endgame for black, obviously. We're gonna leave it there.